The dust kicked up under Vivienne Abbott's boots as she stepped off the stagecoach in Independence, Missouri. That sweltering August afternoon in 1872. Her heart pounding not from excitement, but from the growing dread that had consumed her for the past 3 days of travel. She had come west to marry Richard Huntley, a prosperous cattle broker who had courted her through letters for nearly a year, painting pictures of a life filled with comfort and security on the frontier. The reality that awaited her, however, would shatter every illusion she had carefully constructed during those lonely months back in Philadelphia. The sun beat down mercilessly on the crowded Main Street, and Vivienne adjusted her bonnet, scanning the faces of rough-looking men and weathered women going about their business. Independence had grown rapidly as a jumping-off point for settlers heading further west, and the town buzzed with an energy both exciting and slightly dangerous. She spotted Richard immediately, his tall frame and expensive suit standing out among the dusty cowboys and merchants. He strode toward her with confidence, his handsome face breaking into a smile that did not quite reach his cold blue eyes. "Vivienne, my dear, you have arrived at last," Richard said, taking her gloved hand and pressing it briefly to his lips. The gesture felt perfunctory, lacking any real warmth. "I trust your journey was not too taxing." "It was long, but I am well," Vivienne replied, studying the man she had agreed to marry. In person, he seemed harder somehow, his jaw set in a permanent expression of self-satisfaction. "I am eager to see the home you have described in your letters." "All in good time," Richard said, signaling to a porter to collect her trunks. "First, I have business to attend to at the stockyards. You will accompany me. It is important that you understand the source of our future prosperity." Something in his tone made Vivienne uneasy, but she nodded and allowed him to guide her toward a waiting carriage. As they rode through the bustling streets, Richard spoke at length about his various business ventures, his voice filled with pride and ambition. He mentioned nothing about her journey, asked no questions about her well-being, and seemed entirely absorbed in his own concerns. The stockyards sprawled on the eastern edge of town, a maze of wooden pens filled with cattle awaiting shipment east. The smell hit Vivienne immediately, and she pressed a handkerchief to her nose as Richard helped her down from the carriage. Several men stood near one of the larger pens, deep in conversation, and Richard steered her in their direction. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce my intended Miss Vivienne Abbott," Richard announced. "She has just arrived from Philadelphia. Vivienne, these are my business associates." The men tipped their hats politely, and Vivienne smiled and nodded in return. One of them, a portly man with a thick mustache, grinned broadly at Richard. "Mighty fine catch, Huntley," the man said. "Where did you find this one?" Richard laughed, and the sound made Vivienne's skin prickle. "Through a mutual acquaintance back east." "I specified exactly what I was looking for, and she fits the requirements perfectly. Young, educated enough to manage a household and pretty enough to display at social functions. She will make an excellent addition to my home." Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face. The way Richard spoke about her, as though she were livestock being appraised, made her stomach turn. She opened her mouth to speak, but Richard had already turned back to his associates, launching into a discussion about cattle prices and railroad contracts. "What do you think, Huntley?" "Worth the investment?" another man asked, gesturing toward Vivienne with his cigar. "Indeed," Richard replied. "I have put considerable effort into securing a wife who will reflect well on my position in this community. Women are like horses, gentlemen. You must choose carefully based on breeding and temperament, then train them properly to ensure they serve their purpose." The other men laughed, nodding in agreement, but Vivienne felt as though she had been slapped. She stood frozen, her hands trembling inside her gloves, as Richard continued to discuss her qualities as though she were not standing right there, as though she had no feelings or thoughts of her own. This was not the gentle, romantic suitor who had written her beautiful letters promising partnership and respect. This was a man who saw her as property, an acquisition to enhance his status. A movement caught her eye, and she turned to see a cowboy leaning against a fence post several yards away. He was watching the scene with an expression of barely concealed disgust, his jaw clenched tight. He was younger than Richard, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath his worn hat. His clothes marked him as a working ranch hand, not a wealthy businessman, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that Richard, for all his expensive tailoring, lacked entirely. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Vivienne saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Sympathy, understanding, and something else, a spark of anger on her behalf that matched the outrage building in her own chest. Richard finally concluded his business and guided Vivienne back to the carriage, still talking about his plans to expand his operations. She barely heard him, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. The man she had agreed to marry thought of her as a possession, a decoration to enhance his home. The realization settled over her like a suffocating blanket. That evening, Richard took her to dinner at the finest restaurant in Independence, an establishment that catered to the town's more prosperous citizens. He ordered for her without asking her preferences, then spent the entire meal discussing his own achievements and plans. When Vivienne tried to share her thoughts about potentially opening a small school for children in the area, something she had always dreamed of doing, Richard waved his hand dismissively. "There will be no need for you to work, my dear," he said. "Your duties will be managing my household and entertaining my business associates. Education is wasted on most children anyway, particularly girls. They only need to learn enough to run a home and please a husband." Vivienne set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. "I believe education is important for everyone, Richard. Knowledge enriches our lives and opens doors to opportunity." "You have charming ideals," Richard said with a condescending smile, "but impractical ones. Once we are married, you will see things differently. A woman's place is in the home, supporting her husband's endeavors. That is the natural order of things." "And if I disagree with that natural order?" Vivienne asked quietly. Richard's smile faded, replaced by a harder expression. "Then you will learn to agree." "I am not a harsh man, Vivienne, but I expect obedience from my wife. That is what I specified when I arranged for your introduction, and that is what I will have." The word arranged struck Vivienne like a blow. She thought back to her cousin Margaret, who had introduced her to Richard through letters, and wondered now what exactly had been said, what promises had been made. Had she been sold in a way, packaged and presented to Richard like merchandise? After dinner, Richard escorted her to the boarding house where she would stay until their wedding, scheduled for 3 days hence. He kissed her hand again, that same cold, perfunctory gesture, and left her standing in the doorway feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Vivienne spent a sleepless night in her small room, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with her thoughts. She had no family in Independence, no friends and precious little money of her own. Her parents had died 2 years earlier, leaving her in the care of relatives who viewed her as a burden. When the opportunity to marry Richard had presented itself, it had seemed like a gift, a chance to start fresh in a new place. Now it felt like a trap closing around her. The next morning, she dressed and ventured out into the town, needing air and space to think. Independence was busy even in the early hours, with wagons rolling down the main street and shopkeepers opening their stores. Vivienne walked without a clear destination, her mind churning with impossible choices. She found herself near the stockyards again, though she had not consciously chosen that direction. The cattle lowed in their pens, and men shouted back and forth as they worked. Vivienne stood watching for a moment, then jumped as a voice spoke softly behind her. "You should not be here alone, miss. It is not the safest area of town." She turned to find the cowboy from the previous day standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a warm brown, and his face, though weathered by sun and hard work, was kind. "I needed to walk," Vivienne said. "To think." The cowboy nodded slowly. "I am Frank Palmer. I work for the Double Creek Ranch about 10 miles north of here. I was here yesterday when your intended was speaking about you." "Yes, I saw you," Vivienne said quietly. Frank looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Miss, I know it is not my place to say anything, but what I heard yesterday troubled me greatly. The way that man spoke about you, like you were something he purchased rather than a person deserving of respect and kindness. It was not right." Vivienne felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I am beginning to understand that the man I corresponded with and the man Richard truly is are two very different people." "You deserve better," Frank said simply. "Any woman does. A real man does not treat his wife like property. He treats her as a partner, someone to build a life with, not someone to own and display." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside Vivienne. Here was a stranger, a working cowboy with no reason to involve himself in her troubles, speaking the truth she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. "I have nowhere else to go," Vivienne admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "No family who wants me, very little money." Richard offered security. "Security is not worth sacrificing your dignity," Frank said gently. "And there are always other options, even if they are not obvious right away." Before Vivienne could respond, a harsh voice cut through the morning air. "Vivienne, what are you doing here?" She turned to see Richard striding toward them, his face dark with anger. He grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh even through her sleeve. "I was simply taking a walk," Vivienne said, trying to pull away. "Alone, speaking with a common ranch hand." Richard's eyes blazed. "This is completely inappropriate behavior for my future wife. You will return to your boarding house immediately and remain there until I give you permission to leave." "I am not your wife yet," Vivienne said, anger finally overriding her fear. "And I do not need your permission to take a walk." Richard's grip tightened and Vivienne gasped in pain. In an instant, Frank moved between them, his hand on Richard's wrist. "Let her go," Frank said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "How dare you touch me?" Richard snarled. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Frank replied. "You are a man hurting a woman who cannot defend herself. Let her go, or I will make you let her go." For a long moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tense tableau. Then Richard released Vivienne's arm and stepped back, his face flushed with fury. "This is not finished," Richard said to Vivienne. "You will answer for this embarrassment. And you," he turned to Frank, "will find yourself without work in this territory if I have anything to say about it. I have considerable influence in this town." "Your influence does not concern me," Frank said calmly. "Only what is right." Richard spun on his heel and stalked away, leaving Vivienne trembling in the morning sunlight. She rubbed her arm where Richard had grabbed her, knowing there would be bruises. "Are you all right?" Frank asked, his voice full of concern. "I do not know," Vivienne said honestly. "I think I have just made a terrible situation much worse. Or you have seen the truth clearly for the first time, Frank suggested. That man showed you who he really is. He will not change after marriage. He will only get worse, more controlling, more angry when you do not bend to his will. Vivienne knew Frank was right. The facade Richard had maintained in his letters had completely crumbled, revealing a man who saw women as objects to control and command. She thought about spending the rest of her life under his thumb, bearing his children, pretending to be the perfect, obedient wife he demanded, and felt sick to her stomach. "I cannot marry him," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I cannot live that way." "Then do not," Frank said simply. "There are other choices." "Such as what?" Vivienne asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "I have nowhere to go, no way to support myself. Women have so few options." Frank was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. Then he said carefully, "The Double Creek Ranch where I work is owned by Samuel Carter and his wife, Mary. They are good people, fair and decent. Mary has been looking for help with the household and with teaching their 3 children. The work is hard, but they pay fairly and treat their people with respect. I could speak to them on your behalf." "You would do that for me, a stranger?" Vivienne asked, amazed. "You are not a stranger anymore," Frank said, and something in the way he looked at her made Vivienne's heart beat faster. "You are someone who needs help, and I am someone who can provide it. That is what decent people do for each other." Vivienne made her decision in that moment, acting on instinct and the deep certainty that anything was better than becoming Richard Huntley's wife. "Yes," she said. "Yes, please speak to them. I can teach, I can help with household work. I will do whatever is needed." "Come with me," Frank said. "I was planning to return to the ranch today anyway. We can ride out together and you can meet the Carters." "Richard will be furious," Vivienne said. "He might cause trouble." "Let him try," Frank replied. "Once you are on Carter land, you are under their protection. Richard Huntley may have influence in town, but the ranchers look after their own out here." It took Vivienne less than an hour to gather her few belongings from the boarding house, leaving a brief note for Richard stating that she could not marry him and asking him to consider their engagement ended. Her hands shook as she wrote the words, but her resolve never wavered. She had seen the real Richard Huntley, and she would not bind herself to him for life. Frank had 2 horses waiting when she emerged with her small trunk. He helped her mount, showing her the proper way to sit and hold the reins, his hands gentle and patient. They rode out of Independence heading north, and Vivienne felt as though she could breathe properly for the first time since arriving in Missouri. The landscape opened up before them, rolling prairie dotted with wildflowers and occasional stands of trees. Frank pointed out various landmarks, telling her stories about the area as they rode. He had come west from Kentucky 5 years earlier, drawn by the promise of work and wide open spaces. He had started as a ranch hand and worked his way up to a position of trust and responsibility at the Double Creek. "Tell me about the Carters," Vivienne said as they paused to water the horses at a creek. "Samuel Carter is about 40, a former Army officer who bought the ranch 10 years ago after leaving military service," Frank explained. "His wife Mary is from Ohio originally. They have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from 6 to 12 years old. They are good employers, fair but expecting hard work. Mary is especially kind. She had a difficult time when they first came west, struggling with the isolation and the harsh conditions, so she has sympathy for others in difficult circumstances." "And you think they will take me in, knowing that I am running from an engagement?" Vivienne asked. "I think Mary will understand once she hears your story," Frank said. "She had her own troubles before meeting Samuel. Not every woman comes west by choice or under happy circumstances." They reached the Double Creek Ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The ranch house was a solid structure of wood and stone, with a wide porch and several outbuildings scattered around it. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and the whole place had an air of prosperity tempered with hard work. Mary Carter emerged from the house as they rode up, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a handsome woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Frank, you are back earlier than expected," Mary called. "And you have brought a guest." Frank dismounted and helped Vivienne down from her horse. "Mrs. Carter, this is Miss Vivienne Abbott. She has found herself in difficult circumstances, and I hoped you might be willing to hear her story." Mary studied Vivienne with shrewd but sympathetic eyes. "Come inside, both of you. You must be tired and thirsty from your ride." Inside the ranch house, Vivienne found herself in a comfortable parlor while Mary poured cool water and called for her husband. Samuel Carter was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He listened without interruption as Vivienne explained her situation, from the letter courtship with Richard to the horrifying realization of how he truly viewed women. When she finished, Mary reached over and squeezed her hand. "You were very brave to leave," she said softly. "Many women would have gone through with the marriage, hoping things would improve. They rarely do. Frank mentioned you might need help with the household and teaching your children," Vivienne said. "I am a capable teacher, and I am willing to work hard at whatever tasks you need done." Samuel and Mary exchanged a long look, one of those married communications that requires no words. Then Samuel nodded. "We can offer you room and board plus $20 a month," Samuel said. "In exchange, you will teach our children their lessons each morning and help Mary with household work in the afternoons. Sunday is your own time. We expect honesty and hard work, and in return we offer fair treatment and respect. Does that sound acceptable?" "More than acceptable," Vivienne said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you. You do not know what this means to me." "I think we do," Mary said gently. "Now let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted." Over the following days, Vivienne settled into life at the Double Creek Ranch. The work was indeed hard, harder than anything she had done in her life, but there was a satisfaction in it that she had never experienced. The Carter children, Emma, Luke, and young Thomas, were bright and eager to learn. Vivienne found joy in teaching them reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, watching their faces light up with understanding in the afternoons. She helped Mary with cooking, cleaning, mending, and the endless tasks required to keep a ranch household running. Mary proved to be not just an employer but a friend, sharing stories of her own journey west and offering advice on adapting to frontier life. And then there was Frank. He lived in the bunkhouse with the other ranch hands, but Vivienne found herself watching for him throughout the day, her heart lifting when she caught sight of him working with the horses or riding out to check on the cattle. He had saved her, in a very real way, and she felt drawn to him with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. Frank seemed to feel the same pull. He found reasons to come to the main house more often than strictly necessary, offering to help with tasks that required a man's strength, lingering to talk with Vivienne when their paths crossed. Their conversations ranged from simple observations about the weather to deeper discussions about their hopes and dreams. "I want to have my own ranch someday," Frank told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set. The Carter family had gone into town for supplies, and the two of them had the rare luxury of time alone. "Not as large as the Double Creek, but a place of my own, somewhere I can build something lasting." "That is a worthy dream," Vivienne said. "How long have you been saving toward it?" 5 years now, Frank replied. I am still a ways off from having enough, but I get closer each year. Samuel pays fair wages and I live simply. Another few years, maybe, and I will have enough to buy land and stock it properly. You will make it happen, Vivienne said with certainty. You are the kind of man who follows through on his goals. Frank turned to look at her, his brown eyes serious. I have found a new goal recently, he said quietly. One I had not planned on. What is that? Vivienne asked, though her racing heart suggested she already knew the answer. You, Frank said simply. From the moment I saw you standing there while that fool spoke about you like property, I felt something. And every day since, that feeling has grown stronger. I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know you came here to escape one bad situation. The last thing you need is another man making demands, but I wanted you to know how I feel. Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. She had been fighting her own growing feelings for Frank, telling herself it was too soon, that she needed time to heal from her experience with Richard. But the truth was, what she felt for Frank bore no resemblance to what she had felt for Richard. With Richard, there had been a cautious hope, a practical assessment of compatibility. With Frank, there was fire and genuine connection, a sense of being truly seen and valued for who she was. I feel it too, Vivienne admitted. I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, that I was confusing appreciation with something deeper, but that is not true. When I see you, when we talk, I feel more alive than I have ever felt. You make me want to be brave, to take chances. Frank reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I will never speak to you or about you the way Richard Huntley did, he said. I see you as my equal, as someone with her own thoughts and dreams that matter just as much as mine. If you will have me, if you think you could build a life with me, I promise you that. Yes, Vivienne said, tears of joy sliding down her cheeks. Yes, Frank, I will have you. I want to build that life with you. They sat together as the stars emerged overhead, holding hands and making quiet plans for their future. Frank wanted to speak to Samuel Carter about his intentions, to do things properly. They agreed to take their time with their courtship, despite their strong feelings, wanting to build a foundation of friendship and understanding that would last a lifetime. The peace of their evening was shattered 3 days later, when Richard Huntley arrived at the Double Creek Ranch. Vivienne was in the schoolroom with the Carter children when she heard raised voices from outside. She glanced out the window and felt her stomach drop. Richard stood in the yard, speaking loudly to Samuel Carter while Frank and 2 other ranch hands watched with tense expressions. Continue with your reading assignments, Vivienne told the children, keeping her voice calm despite her pounding heart. She walked outside, determined to face Richard rather than cower inside. There she is, Richard said when he spotted her. Vivienne, this foolishness has gone on long enough. You will collect your things and return to town with me immediately. No, Vivienne said clearly. I ended our engagement, Richard. I am not going anywhere with you. You do not have a choice, Richard said, his face reddening. I have invested considerable time and expense in you. I arranged for your transport west. I made plans. I introduced you to my associates. You are contracted to marry me. There is no contract, Vivienne replied. And even if there were, I would not honor it. You showed me your true nature, Richard. I will not spend my life with a man who views me as property. You ungrateful girl, Richard snarled. Do you think anyone else will want you now? You are damaged goods, a woman who ran away from her engagement. I am willing to overlook this embarrassing episode, but only if you come back now. She said no, Frank interjected, moving to stand beside Vivienne. You need to leave. Richard's eyes narrowed as he recognized Frank from their previous encounter. You, he spat. I should have known you were behind this. What did you promise her? a cowboy with nothing but debts and dreams. I promised her respect, Frank said evenly, something you clearly do not understand. Mr. Huntley, you are not welcome on my land, Samuel Carter said firmly. Miss Abbott is under my protection and she has made her choice clear. I suggest you return to independence. This is not over, Richard said, pointing at Vivienne. I have friends in this territory, men of influence. I will see to it that all of you regret this. You will find yourself without work, Palmer. And you, Vivienne, will discover what life is like when you burn your bridges. No decent man will touch you once I spread the word about your behavior. Then I guess I am not a decent man by your standards, Frank said calmly, and I am fine with that. Richard climbed back into his carriage, his face twisted with fury. As he drove away, Vivienne felt her knees go weak with relief. Frank steadied her with a hand on her elbow. That man is dangerous, Samuel said quietly. He has the kind of pride that does not accept defeat. We will need to be careful. His words proved prophetic. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard made good on his threats. He spread rumors throughout Independence and the surrounding area, painting Vivienne as a woman of loose morals and Frank as a seducer of innocent women. Several of Samuel Carter's business associates began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with the scandal. More concerning, Frank started receiving threats. Anonymous notes were left for him warning that he should leave the territory if he valued his life. One of the ranch horses was found with a cut saddle strap, an accident waiting to happen. Samuel increased security around the ranch, but the situation cast a shadow over what should have been a happy time. Vivienne felt guilty that her presence had brought such trouble, but Frank refused to hear any talk of her leaving. "This is not your fault," he insisted during one of their evening conversations. "You did nothing wrong by refusing to marry a man who disrespected you. Richard Huntley is responsible for his own actions, and he will tire of this eventually." But Richard did not tire. His campaign of harassment continued for another month until finally, Samuel Carter had enough. He rode into Independence and confronted Richard directly, backed by several neighboring ranchers who had heard about the situation and disapproved of Richard's behavior. The message was clear: leave Frank Palmer and Vivienne Abbott alone, or face the united opposition of the ranching community. Richard, for all his bluster, understood when he was beaten. The ranchers represented a significant economic force in the region, and alienating them would damage his business far more than accepting the loss of Vivienne. He agreed to cease his harassment, though the cold fury in his eyes suggested he would never truly forgive the slight. With that threat removed, life at the Double Creek Ranch returned to normal. Summer faded into autumn, the prairie grass turning gold under the big sky. Vivienne continued teaching the Carter children and helping Mary with household tasks, but increasingly, her future seemed to lie elsewhere. Frank had been saving his wages diligently, and with Samuel Carter's help, he found a parcel of land for sale about 15 miles from the Double Creek. It was not much, only 160 acres with a small creek running through it, but it had potential. Frank made an offer, and in November of 1872 the land became his. On a crisp December morning, Frank Palmer and Vivienne Abbott were married in Independence by a traveling preacher. The ceremony was simple, held at the small church with the Carter family and several ranch hands in attendance. Mary Carter had helped Vivienne sew a new dress in pale blue, and Frank wore his best suit, nervous but beaming. When the preacher asked if Frank would honor and cherish Vivienne, he answered with a firm, clear "I will" that echoed through the small building. And when Vivienne was asked if she would love and respect Frank, she met his eyes and said, "I will," with absolute certainty. They sealed their vows with a kiss that felt like a promise, the beginning of a new chapter built on mutual respect and genuine love. The first year of their marriage was marked by hard work and simple joys. Frank built a modest cabin on their land while Vivienne continued teaching the Carter children part-time to bring in extra money. They spent their evenings planning and dreaming, slowly transforming the raw land into a working ranch. Frank proved to be everything Vivienne had hoped for in a husband. He consulted her on every major decision, valued her opinions, and treated her as a true partner. When she suggested, they raise not just cattle but also horses, specializing in quality working stock, Frank listened and agreed it was a sound plan. When he wanted to expand their small herd, he discussed the financial implications with her carefully, respecting her input. Their first winter together was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold, but they weathered it together, keeping each other warm and entertained with stories, plans, and the deepening intimacy of their relationship. By spring, Vivienne knew she was carrying their first child. The pregnancy was not easy. Vivienne suffered from sickness in the early months, and as her belly grew, the physical demands of frontier life became more challenging. But Frank was attentive and protective without being overbearing, finding ways to ease her burden while still respecting her desire to remain active and useful. Their son was born in October of 1873, a healthy boy with his father's brown eyes and his mother's determination. They named him James Franklin Palmer, and Frank wept when he first held his son, overwhelmed with love and responsibility. "He will grow up knowing his mother is an equal partner in this life," Frank said as he cradled the infant. "He will learn to respect women not as property, but as people with their own worth and value." Vivienne smiled through her exhaustion. "And he will learn that from watching his father," she said softly. The Palmer Ranch, as their land became known, grew slowly but steadily over the next several years. By 1876, they had a respectable herd of cattle and a growing reputation for quality horses. Frank's skill with training and Vivienne's eye for breeding produced animals that ranchers throughout the region sought out. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Rose in 1875, and another son they called William in 1878. The cabin was expanded into a proper house with 4 bedrooms and a spacious kitchen where the family gathered each evening. Vivienne never forgot her dream of teaching, and in 1879 she opened a small school on their property for children from neighboring ranches. Frank built a 1-room schoolhouse, and 3 times a week, Vivienne taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history to a dozen children of various ages. She charged modest tuition for those who could afford it and taught for free those who could not. "You are making a difference," Frank told her, watching through the window as she worked with a struggling student. "These children will have opportunities they never would have had without you." "We are making a difference," Vivienne corrected him. "Everything we have built together." On a warm evening in June of 1880, Vivienne and Frank sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard. James was 6 now, a serious boy who loved helping his father with the horses. Rose was 5, imaginative and kind, always creating elaborate games for her younger brother. William toddled after his siblings, determined not to be left behind at age 2. "You ever think about how different your life would have been if you had married Richard Huntley?" Frank asked, taking Vivienne's hand in his. Vivienne shuddered. "I try not to," she admitted. "But sometimes I cannot help it. I would have been miserable, trapped in a life where I was valued only for how I reflected on him." "Instead, you are here," Frank said, gesturing at the ranch spread out before them. "Building a school, raising horses, teaching our children to be kind and strong. You are exactly who you were meant to be. We are exactly who we were meant to be, Vivienne said. Together. She thought about that moment in Independence 8 years earlier, when Frank had first told her she deserved better. At the time, she had been terrified, unsure if she could survive on her own, convinced that security with Richard was better than uncertainty alone. But Frank had shown her another path, one built on respect and partnership rather than ownership and control. Life on the frontier was not easy. They had faced droughts, harsh winters, financial struggles, and the countless challenges that came with ranching and raising a family. But they had faced all of it together as equal partners, and that made all the difference. "I love you," Vivienne said, squeezing Frank's hand. "Thank you for telling me I deserved better all those years ago." "I love you too," Frank replied. "Though I think you would have figured it out on your own eventually. You are the strongest, smartest, most capable woman I have ever known." As the sun set over the Missouri prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the Palmer family remained on the porch. James ran up to ask his father about the new foal in the barn, and Frank lifted him onto his lap to explain the finer points of horse breeding. Rose climbed into her mother's lap with a book, asking Vivienne to read her a story. William played at their feet with wooden toys Frank had carved. This was the life Vivienne had chosen, or rather, the life she had been brave enough to claim when the alternative became unbearable. She had rejected a future as property in favor of a future as a partner, and in doing so, she had found not just love but genuine happiness. Years would pass, bringing more children, more challenges, more triumphs. The Palmer Ranch would grow into one of the most respected horse operations in western Missouri. Vivienne's school would expand, eventually becoming a permanent institution in the county with multiple teachers. Their children would grow up to become respected members of their community, carrying forward the values of equality and respect they learned from their parents. But on that June evening in 1880, none of that future was visible. What mattered was the present moment. A family gathered together on the porch of a home built by their own hands, bound by love and respect, rather than obligation and ownership. Frank caught Vivienne's eye over their children's heads and smiled, that same warm smile that had first made her heart race 8 years earlier. She smiled back, filled with gratitude for the courage she had found to walk away from Richard Huntley and toward a man who saw her as she truly was. She deserved better, Frank had told her, and in building a life with him, she had found not just better but the very best. A partnership built on equality, a love grounded in respect, and a future limited only by their shared dreams and determination. As night fell over the Palmer Ranch, the family eventually moved inside for supper and evening chores. Vivienne lit the lamps while Frank helped James with his reading lessons. Rose set the table with careful precision, and William babbled happily from his high chair. It was an ordinary evening, one of thousands they would share together over the course of their long marriage. But it was also extraordinary in its own way, a testament to the life Vivienne had chosen when she decided she would not be treated as property. She had demanded respect and received love. She had sought partnership and found her soulmate. And in the years that followed, through all the joys and sorrows that life would bring, she never once regretted that hot August day in 1872 when she walked away from Richard Huntley and toward Frank Palmer. The cowboy had told her she deserved better, and then he had spent the rest of his life proving it to her every single day. And that, Vivienne thought as she surveyed her family gathered around the dinner table, was the greatest gift of all.